Now let's discuss a slightly alternative approach where you are converting the existing prosthesis. How would you do that? First and foremost, again, you would select and insert the locator abutments in the patient's mouth. You would insert the denture cap in the patient's mouth. And you're going to try to pick them up with some sort of an impression material. And we want to avoid any possibility that the material, the pickup material, is going to lock around the locator abutments. And in order to prevent that, there are special rings, little white rings that you can see on the images. They come as part of the package that you purchase. You don't have to purchase them separately. And need to be inserted precisely to prevent or to close off access to any space around the shaft of the abutment to prevent the material from locking onto it. We then want to take the existing prosthesis and we want to relieve its inner aspect so it sits back to its appropriate position freely around the just inserted locator abutments as well as denture cap housing that's sitting on top of it. And then you would use a material, and a number of materials, some light cure, some self-setting, that can be used to pick up the locator housings. One of the important aspects here is to recognize that this description only works if the existing prosthesis is otherwise perfectly adapted to the tissues. But that may not be the case because the person had surgery in the area and the prosthesis likely was relined. In those situations, in addition to possibly picking up the housings, you would also need to reline the prosthesis and then send it to the lab for processing. So again, I want to repeat now this description, but just a little bit more detail with a bit of text to help you follow along. This approach, again, the conversion of this prosthesis begins by ensuring that the existing prosthesis is in fact optimally adapted to the tissues, because if it is not, when we go to pick up the housing, that is not going to work appropriately. You then need to remove the healing abutments, measure the soft tissues, order the locator abutment of the appropriate height, insert token into place. You would then position a denture housing as well as this white ring that I had just mentioned that will help prevent the acrylic or silver material from locking around the abutment. We would want to relieve the inner aspect of the prosthesis so it sits freely back onto the tissues. It's often a good idea to create so much relief. There's actually a small, quote-unquote, perforation to the prosthesis. You can think of it as a relief vent. And then once everything is seated, you would inject the pickup material within the relief area. So the prosthesis, you would seat the prosthesis. You would have the patient go through the usual tongue movements, cheek movements, lip movements, etc. Let the material set, and then you would remove the prosthesis and optimize, adjust, polish, etc. as needed. Again, you would want to insert the prosthesis with the lowest amount of retention, which typically means keeping the black porcelain nails in place, letting the patient wear that for a short period of time, go through the various adjustments to the fitting surface, and then once the patient becomes accustomed, now insert something with slightly greater amount of retention, and typically that means inserting blue processing nails. And that patient goes into maintenance. And part of the patient maintenance, of course, is keeping things clean and returning to you on a regular basis to ensure that the implants are healthy and osseointegrated, make sure the tissues are healthy, and ensuring that the prosthesis is continuing to work as well as it did at the time of its insertion. So when you see the patients back for reassessment or maintenance, what would you be looking at or assessing or examining? Well, you'll be looking at patient concerns or complaints, and there may not be any, but what kind of concerns my patients have? They might complain of aesthetics, of things wearing down. They might complain of comfort because something is sore or uncomfortable. And they may complain of function-related issues where there's, for example, a greater than a desired degree of movement of the prosthesis, or poor retention in plain language. You would also assess the patient, the tissues. You would take radiographs. Here we're looking at, again, at health and osteointegration duration of the implants, at the person's ability to perform appropriate home care. You would look at wear of the prosthesis, fit of the prosthesis, retention of the prosthesis, and making sure that everything is in fact properly engaging the prosthesis, and that the abutments are properly engaged and still torqued to the implants, and the denture cap, denture housing is firmly embedded within the acrylic of the prosthesis. And then based on your observation of the patient's concerns and your clinical observations, this may lead then you to take actions with respect to the prosthesis. And then maybe no action required other than seeing the patient back for another follow-up in a year or so. And usually once yearly follow-up will be relatively standard. Or you may choose to repair the prosthesis. You may choose to mentor the patient with respect to home care. You may need to change retentive inserts, etc. Now, I've just focused my conversation regarding mandibular implant support overdentures. But I want to acknowledge that there are other prosthesis or treatment modalities that utilize the same approach of utilizing a removable prosthesis and engaging it to a small number of strategically placed implants and individual attachments to those implants. Well, one example is we could utilize a removable prosthesis in a partially edentulous context where the person still has some of their teeth present. They have a removable partial denture, and now there's one or two implants being inserted, and now that improves the retention of that removable prosthesis. The implants could also be placed sometimes not so much to improve retention of the prosthesis, but they may be placed sometimes to eliminate the clasps on the interior most retentive elements, thereby improving the aesthetics. What's another example of the utilization of implants in individual attachments with removable prosthesis? And that's a maxillary implant support overdenture. One big advantage of maxillary implant support overdenture compared to conventional denture is this allows for the palate to be clear or open or horseshoe design-like. I'd like to conclude this presentation by speaking a little bit about what are some of the concerns or challenges or difficulties that a patient may present to you following insertion of an implant support overdenture, either a brand new prosthesis or a converted prosthesis. Well, one thing that may be immediately an issue is you may realize that the prosthesis does not fit in the mouth in the same way as it fits on a master cast. You may notice the prosthesis is rocking, or sometimes it just obviously just does not fit. It seems to have zero retention in the mouth. What could be some of the reasons? Well, of course, it could be there's just a gross amount of distortion or inaccuracy in the original impression, which would require a complete remake. It could be, and this is not intuitive necessarily, that there's just too much retention in the prosthesis. So what feels clinically as no retention, that's because the retentive inserts are so tight, they can't even seat properly on the locator abutments. It could also be the locator abutments have loosened. They're not stable on the implants. And so what's happening when you go to try to insert the prosthesis, it requires locator abutments to be stable. And if they're not stable, you're going to have a hard time inserting the prosthesis. And so the solution, of course, would involve sort of going stepwise through each of these possibilities and try to rule out or confirm that is in fact the issue. So using the example of loose abutments, you would check, are the abutments loose? And if they are, then you would go and, of course, retorque them in place, keeping in mind that you also think about, well, why have the abutments have become loose? Is it because there's something interfering with the occlusion? Is it because you did not torque them appropriately or correctly in the first place? What's another challenge sometimes that can be an immediate concern is you've inserted the prosthesis and you suddenly realize you can't actually remove it. It's too much retention. And at first it sounds like a good idea. It's amazing, but it's not a good idea because if you insert the prosthesis and the person is in discomfort, which they would often will be, because the prosthesis may be applying a little bit too much pressure, well, now the fact that they can't instantly remove it becomes a true problem. So how does this happen? This happens because there was just too much retention utilized in the fabrication of the prosthesis. And the solution always, as we already alluded earlier, is to always use the lowest amount of retention and make a note of elements in the design or the situation that in principle may lead to a greater or too great amount of retention. And implants being cyclical to each other is one good example of that occurring. It may be that the patient is just not happy with the amount of retention. Either way, too much retention or too little retention. Why might this be the case? Well, this might just be a matter of consent, where you just did not advise the patient appropriately as to what to expect with the removal of prosthesis. So one thing to always remind patients is that at the end of the day, although the implants are going to help hold this piece in place, but they're still removable prosthesis. They are going to move in function. The person will be able to move them with their tongue. And so having sort of that mental preparation is particularly important. The prosthesis needs to be appropriately extended. If it's overextended, underextended, all those things are going to lead to the prosthesis being more easily movable by the patient or during function than it otherwise would be. And, this is why it's important when we're fabricating the implant support overdenture to utilize the same key principles of prosthodontics as you would with conventional removable prosthesis. Sometimes patients may complain of food getting caught underneath their prosthesis. And as we all know, that is not only a little bit annoying because food is caught there, but as soon as food is caught there, that instantly is going to lead to prosthesis not seating properly into place, which sort of becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. So why might the patient complain of food getting caught underneath? It could be that there's literally a space present underneath the prosthesis because when you insert the prosthesis, it was never properly adapted to the tissues. But it could also be the case that there is just too much movement in the prosthesis during function, and because there's too much movement, it's allowing for food to occasionally get caught underneath the prosthesis. And so the solution to these issues is identifying what the issue is. So there's a lack of adaptation. We need to provide adaptation. If there's too much movement in the prosthesis, we have to figure out why there's too much movement and find a solution for that. One of the challenges that's I would really describe as occasionally a bad day occurs when during a conversion of an existing removable prosthesis and overdenture, during the pickup of the housings, if the prosthesis clinically appears to have locked on the abutments. And that's a challenge to manage because there's no easy way to just magically retrieve it once it has locked into place. And so it's really the prevention that needs to be the focus of this particular issue. And the way to prevent this is to control the amount of material that we use for pickup. It's to control the amount of viscosity of the material. It's making sure we block out the abutment. That's those clear rings I spoke about earlier. It's making sure that there are vents for the material to go somewhere to escape. And it's definitely not a bad idea, especially if there's a large number of implants being picked up early on in your experience with several prostheses, is maybe just to pick them up one at a time. So picking things one at a time it's not going to prevent things from locking, but it's definitely easier to manage only one implant getting locked than if they're both locked into place. If you do run into a situation where prosthesis is locked during pickup, the management is to first try to lift the prosthesis off, and occasionally that may work. But ultimately, if push comes to shove, you need to pick up a burr and just very slowly drill out the denture cap or around the denture cap and essentially freeing the prosthesis from the abutment. Recognizing that that's challenging to do because you're trying the process not damaging the prosthesis in the housing and the abutment too much, but also not accidentally lacerating the person's tissues. Another challenge that may arise is that during the pickup, following the pickup, you may recognize that the prosthesis does not seem to occlude correctly with the opposing jaw. And the reason this may happen is because the denture, the prosthesis during pickup, as part of pickup, was making contact with the housing and essentially has shifted slightly during the pickup. And so therefore the solution is to absolutely ensure that, number one, the prosthesis does not make contact with the denture caps, and also that during the pickup, you've made sure that the patient closes the mouth at some stage to confirm that the occlusal relationship is correct. So in conclusion, we've covered a number of elements today with respect to mandibular implant support overdentures. I'd like to highlight the mandibular implant support overdentures are a very versatile and cost-effective treatment modality, and in many ways should be the first therapy or the first treatment of choice for patients who are edentulous or about to become edentulous. 2, non-split individual attachments is really the standard approach nowadays. There's no need in general to have more than 2 implants or to split them together. There are many attachment mechanisms, but locator abutments are by far the most common abutment to be used, and I think is a good first choice abutment for a practitioner to utilize. And one the things that make locator abutments very beneficial is they are versatile in amount of retention, and they are short, which means they don't interfere, or they provide least interference with the restorative space, especially when that is limited. Once the implants are in place, in many situations, if the existing prosthesis is appropriate, it can be converted. The alternative would be to fabricate a brand new prosthesis, and both approaches are completely appropriate, but both have nuances and technique-specific matters that need to be, of course, clearly followed. And as with any treatment, there can be challenges and difficulties that you need to be aware of and manage. But fortunately, the vast majority of these are easily preventable and easily managed once they are recognized. I'd like to thank you for your time. I hope that you found this lecture on implant support overdentures useful. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me through email. Good luck.